Imagine standing on the walls of Delhi in the winter of 1299. You are looking north, and what you see on the horizon is not dust from a sandstorm. It is not a cloud rolling in from the mountains. What you are seeing is the ground itself shaking. 200,000 horses, 200,000 Mongol warriors, the most feared army in the history of the human race, moving toward you like a wave that has never, in 200 years, broken against anything it could not destroy. This is not a rumor. This is not a warning from a distant province that might be exaggerated. The scouts have confirmed it. The intelligence networks have confirmed it. The refugees flooding into Delhi from the north have confirmed it with their own terrified eyes. The Mongols are coming. And not just any Mongols. This army is led by Qutlugh Khwaja, the son of one of the most powerful Mongol rulers alive. This is the full might of the Chagatai Khanate, the western branch of the greatest empire the world has ever seen, pointed directly at the heart of India. Every city these warriors have ever approached has either opened its gates in surrender or been reduced to rubble and silence. Baghdad, the most magnificent city in the Islamic world, burned to the ground in 1258, and an estimated 800,000 people killed in just a few days. Samarkand, Nishapur, Urgench, cities that had stood for centuries, wiped from existence. The Mongols did not just conquer, they erased. They turned civilizations into cautionary tales. And now they wanted Delhi. But here is what the history books don't always shout loud enough. What happened next? At a place so small it barely appears on most maps, a patch of flat ground called Kili, just outside Delhi, was one of the most extraordinary military upsets of the entire medieval world. An army that had never been stopped, that had rewritten the rules of warfare, that had made entire empires kneel, was about to meet something it had never encountered before. A sultan who refused to be afraid. A strategy built not on hope, but on cold, brilliant, terrifying calculation, and a battle that would echo through the centuries. This is the Battle of Kili, and if you have never heard of it, that is about to change right now. Stay with me all the way to the end, because this story has twists you will not see coming. To truly feel the weight of what happened at Kili, you need to go back further, much further. You need to understand who the Mongols were before they were an empire, because the story of how a scattered collection of nomadic tribes on the cold grasslands of Central Asia became the most devastating military force in human history is itself one of the most staggering stories ever told. In the late 12th century, those grasslands, the great steppe that stretched from what is now Mongolia westward toward Russia, were home to dozens of competing tribal groups. They fought each other constantly, alliances formed and broke apart. Children were taken as slaves, families were destroyed in raids and counter-raids. It was a brutal, fragmented world, with no central authority and no unifying vision. And then came Temujin. Born around 1162, Temujin had a childhood that would have broken most people. His father was poisoned when Temujin was just 9 years old. His own tribe abandoned him and his family, leaving them to starve on the steppe. He was captured by a rival clan as a teenager and kept as a slave. He escaped. He rebuilt himself from nothing, and through a combination of military genius, ruthless political skill, and an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty in the people around him, he united the tribes of Mongolia one by one, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through war, until in 1206 he was declared Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. What followed was unlike anything the world had seen before or has seen since. In the space of a single generation, the Mongol armies under Genghis, and then his sons and grandsons, swept across an area of land so vast it staggers the imagination. By the time the empire reached its peak in the mid-13th century, it stretched from the Pacific Ocean in the east to the borders of Poland and Hungary in the west, from Siberia in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. 33 million square kilometers, 1/5 of all the land on Earth, and the engine of this conquest was the Mongol military machine, a system of warfare so advanced, so flexible and so psychologically overwhelming that it remains one of the most studied military phenomena in history. The Mongols fought on horseback. Every warrior was a rider almost from birth, and the bond between a Mongol cavalryman and his horse was something that standing armies of farmers and foot soldiers simply could not replicate. A Mongol warrior could ride for days without stopping, survive on almost nothing, and still arrive at the battlefield ready to fight. Their speed was their first weapon, and it was devastating. But speed was only the beginning. The Mongols were also brilliant tacticians. They used feigned retreats, pulling back from an enemy position to draw the opponent out, then turning and destroying the pursuing force when it had lost its formation. They used coordinated flanking, maneuvers that required a level of discipline and communication across a battlefield that most medieval armies could only dream of. They gathered intelligence obsessively before every campaign, studying the terrain, the enemy's strengths and weaknesses, the political divisions they could exploit. They were not just warriors, they were strategists of the highest order. And there was the psychological element, which might have been the most powerful weapon of all. The Mongols understood terror as a military tool better than almost anyone in history. The policy was simple and brutally effective. Surrender and be spared. Resist and face total annihilation. Every man, woman, and child, every building, every crop in the fields, total destruction. And they followed through on this promise so reliably, so consistently, that word traveled ahead of them like a shockwave. Cities that had never even seen a Mongol warrior would open their gates simply because they had heard what happened to the cities that didn't. By the 1290s, this machine had conquered most of the known world, and it was turning its eyes toward India. The Delhi Sultanate that the Mongols now had in their sights was itself a relatively young and turbulent power. Founded in 1206, the same year Genghis Khan unified Mongolia, which is a striking historical coincidence. The Sultanate had gone through multiple dynasties and a long series of rulers of varying competence. By the late 1200s, it was nominally powerful, but had shown limited ability to deal with the Mongol threat. Earlier raids had pushed deep into the Punjab. Lahore had been sacked. The Mongols had crossed the Indus River multiple times, taken what they wanted, and each time they came, it was like a reminder: we can do this whenever we choose. The only question is when we decide to do it in full force. And then, in 1296, everything about the Sultanate changed in a single afternoon of blood. His name was Alauddin Khilji, and the way he came to power was as dark and dramatic as anything in the history of medieval rulership. Alauddin was the nephew of the reigning Sultan, Alauddin Khilji, a relatively mild and tolerant man who had shown Alauddin considerable trust and favor. He gave his nephew military commands, important positions, real power, and Alauddin repaid that trust by engineering his uncle's murder. In July of 1296, Alauddin invited Sultan Jalaluddin to a meeting under the pretense of a formal reconciliation after a period of tension between them. The Sultan, who was elderly and who apparently genuinely believed his nephew wanted peace, came to the meeting with a small escort. Alauddin had his own men waiting. As the Sultan and Alauddin embraced in greeting, Alauddin's soldiers struck. The Sultan was killed on the spot. His head was displayed publicly to signal the end of his reign and the beginning of a new one. It was cold. It was calculated. It was a brutal act of betrayal by almost any moral standard. And it tells you almost everything you need to know about Alauddin Khilji, his capacity for ruthlessness, his willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals, and the absolute steel of his ambition. He was not a man who was going to be stopped by sentiment or hesitation. But here is the thing that history forces you to reckon with. That same cold, calculating ruthlessness, that same willingness to make brutal decisions for strategic ends, is precisely what made Alauddin Khilji the one man in the entire subcontinent capable of stopping the Mongols. Because stopping the Mongols was not going to be a job for a gentle ruler. It was not going to be accomplished through diplomacy or hope or prayers. It was going to require someone who could think as clearly and as coldly as the Mongols themselves. And Alauddin was exactly that person. Almost immediately after taking power, Alauddin turned his attention to the existential threat on India's northwestern frontier. He had seen what the Mongols did, he had studied their methods, and he understood something that previous sultans had failed to grasp at a deep enough level, that the Mongols were beatable, but only if you stopped trying to fight them the way everyone else fought them, and started building something completely different. What he built over the next 3 years was extraordinary. First, the army. Alauddin massively expanded the Delhi Sultanate's military, recruiting tens of thousands of new cavalrymen and infantrymen, and training them with an intensity that was unusual for the era. He standardized their equipment, he established clear chains of command, he insisted on regular training, and maintained strict discipline in a way that transformed what had been a somewhat improvised collection of forces into something approaching a professional standing army. But the most revolutionary thing Alauddin did was fix how his soldiers were paid. In most medieval armies, soldiers supplemented their wages through looting, taking valuables from conquered territories and defeated enemies. This created armies that were incentivized to plunder rather than follow orders, that might break formation to grab treasure at a critical moment, or that might be reluctant to engage because they didn't want to risk dying before they could collect their share of the spoils. Alauddin changed the model. He paid his soldiers directly, in cash, at rates that made looting unnecessary. He instituted a system of price controls in Delhi so that his soldiers' wages went further, allowing him to keep a larger army at lower effective cost. It was economically innovative and militarily transformative. He also built something that modern analysts might recognize as an intelligence service, a network of spies and informants that monitored the movements of Mongol forces far to the north and west, giving Alauddin early warning of invasions and allowing him to begin mobilizing before the enemy had reached Indian territory. He was not going to be caught unprepared. He was not going to be reactive. He was going to know the Mongols were coming before they arrived at his gates. And he fortified, he strengthened existing defensive structures, built new ones, and thought carefully about the geography of northern India and how it could be used to his advantage. Every element of his preparation pointed toward a single recognition. The day was coming when the Mongols would arrive in full force, and when that day came, Delhi needed to be ready. By the autumn of 1299, the day had arrived. Qutlugh Khwaja crossed into India with an army that contemporary sources describe in numbers ranging from 100,000 to 200,000 warriors. Even taking the most conservative estimate, this was an invasion force of staggering size, vastly larger than anything the Delhi Sultanate had faced before. These were hardened Mongol cavalry fighters, veterans of campaigns across Central Asia, disciplined and experienced and supremely confident. They had rolled through the Punjab like a flood, meeting minimal resistance. Towns and villages that lay in their path were swept aside or fled at their approach. The Mongol advance was fast, faster than most armies of the era could have moved with a force that size. By the time Alauddin's intelligence networks confirmed the full scale of the invasion, Qutlugh Khwaja's forces were already well inside Indian territory and bearing down on Delhi from the northwest. Inside Delhi, the atmosphere was one of controlled fear. The people knew what was coming. Whoa. Red spread through the markets and the streets and the mosques. The Mongols are here, and this time it is not a raid. This time they mean to stay. Refugees from the north crowded into the city, bringing stories that grew darker with each telling. Entire villages burned, fields destroyed, people taken as slaves or simply killed where they stood. And in the throne room of Delhi, Alauddin Khilji was listening to his advisors argue that he should do the sensible thing. The sensible thing, according to almost every senior voice in his court, was to stay behind the walls. Delhi's fortifications were formidable. The Mongols, for all their brilliance in open field warfare, had a relatively poor record at sustained sieges, particularly in the heat of the Indian climate. The argument was logical and not without merit. Let the Mongols exhaust themselves against the walls. Let the Indian summer sap their strength. Wait until they grow impatient and withdraw as they had done before. It was the strategy of survival. It was the strategy of not losing. But Alauddin was not interested in not losing. He was interested in winning. And more than winning a single battle, He was interested in changing the entire strategic picture in a way that would last. He understood that if he hid behind his walls again, the Mongols would come back. And again, and again. Each time learning more, probing deeper, testing different approaches. Eventually, they would find the crack. Eventually, patience and numbers and relentlessness would overcome even the strongest fortifications. Defensive strategy alone was not going to save India in the long run. He needed to meet the Mongols in the field. He needed to beat them so clearly, so unmistakably, that the message would travel all the way back to Central Asia. This is not worth the cost. Against the advice of his entire court, Alauddin ordered the army to march. The two forces converged near a place called Kili, approximately 60 kilometers from Delhi, in late 1299. The exact date is debated among historians, but the season was winter, which actually matters because winter was when Mongol forces preferred to campaign in India, since the heat of Indian summers was brutal for steppe warriors and their horses. Even in choosing the timing of their invasion, the Mongols were calculating. And even in that calculation, Alauddin had an answer. As the Delhi army moved into position near Kili, Alauddin was doing something that was almost as important as anything that would happen in the battle itself. He was organizing his force with a tactical intelligence that recognized the fundamental nature of the Mongol threat. His army was divided into several distinct divisions. He placed experienced commanders over each wing, men he trusted to hold their positions under pressure, to execute the plan without improvising, to resist the natural human instinct to react emotionally when things got chaotic. He placed himself at the center with a substantial reserve force, held back from the main line of battle. This reserve was the heart of his strategy. It was his answer to the Mongol tactic of gradual pressure, of finding the weak point and exploiting it. If the Mongols broke through, somewhere the reserve could respond. If the moment came when the enemy was overextended, the reserve could strike. It was a patient, disciplined approach. The kind of approach that required enormous self-control from a commander who could see the battle unfolding in front of him and feel the pull of every instinct to throw everything he had into the fight immediately. Among Alauddin's commanders that day was a man named Zafar Khan, and this is where the story of the Battle of Kili takes one of its most extraordinary, most heartbreaking, and Zafar Khan was, by every account that has survived, a military commander of exceptional ability. His soldiers adored him with the kind of genuine, deep loyalty that cannot be manufactured, the kind that develops only when men have followed someone into battle and seen him fight, seen him lead, seen him refuse to flinch when everything around them was chaos. He was aggressive in the way that the best offensive commanders always are, with an instinct for the moment of vulnerability, for the precise second when a retreating enemy can be turned into a routed one if you hit hard enough and fast enough. He was, in short, exactly the kind of general that wars are won by. He was also, some historians have suggested, exactly the kind of general that powerful sultans lose sleep over. The battle opened with the Mongols doing what the Mongols always did. They sent probing attacks across different sections of the Delhi line, looking for the seams, looking for the places where the formation was weak or where the soldiers were nervous. They used their characteristic harassment tactics, swift cavalry charges that would strike and pull back before the enemy could respond effectively, designed to keep the opponent reactive and off balance, to prevent them from ever setting their feet and fighting on their own terms. It was a system designed to unravel armies, to turn disciplined formations into confused, scrambling individuals who could then be picked apart piecemeal. But the Delhi army held. Alauddin's years of training and preparation were visible in every unit that absorbed a Mongol attack and reformed, that held its position rather than chasing the retreating enemy cavalry, that kept its discipline when everything around it was screaming movement and aggression. The line bent under pressure, but it did not break, and then Zafar Khan's section of the line something no one had expected. It stopped bending and started pushing. Zafar Khan's forces not only held their ground against the Mongol assault on their section of the field, they began to drive the Mongols back. The ferocity of their counterattack caught the Mongols in their sector off guard. Bodies of Mongol cavalry that were accustomed to setting the pace of an engagement found themselves suddenly on the defensive, suddenly absorbing blows rather than delivering them. And Zafar Khan, watching this happening, felt the pull that every aggressive commander feels when an opportunity opens. The sense that the moment is now, that hesitation means losing the chance forever. That the rules of the battle plan matter less than the reality unfolding in front of his eyes. He charged, not a controlled incremental advance, not a tactical pressure that stayed within the boundaries of Alauddin's overall plan. A full, committed, explosive charge with everything he had, driving deep into the Mongol formation on his section of the field, burning through their lines like a fire that has caught a strong wind. The attack was devastating. Thousands of Mongol warriors fell before his onslaught. The Mongol commanders on that part of the field were genuinely shaken by the violence and momentum of what hit them. And then the Mongols did what the Mongols always did when something unexpected happened. They adapted. Rather than continuing to absorb Zafar Khan's charge and allowing it to push them further back, the Mongol cavalry on the flanks of his advance began to curve inward, like a hand closing around a stone. Zafar Khan had driven so deep into the Mongol position, so far beyond the Delhi main line, that the space between him and the rest of Alauddin's army was growing. The Mongols flowed into that space. They cut around the sides of his advance. They began to encircle him. The reinforcements that might have followed him, that might have supported his charge and turned an aggressive gamble into a decisive breakthrough. They did not come. There are two ways to read what happened next, and historians have argued about it ever since. The first reading is that Alauddin made a cold, rational tactical decision. Sending the reserve into that gap would have committed his entire army to a chaotic, fragmented engagement deep in Mongol-controlled space. Exactly the kind of fight the Mongols were best at. The reserve stayed back to maintain the integrity of the Delhi position, and Zafar Khan's charge, however brilliant and however costly, served the battle's overall outcome by drawing in enormous Mongol forces and inflicting enormous casualties, even as it ended in his death. The second reading is darker and more personal. There were whispers even at the time, whispers that became louder in the years that followed, that Alauddin did not want to save Zafar Khan, that the Sultan, brilliant and ruthless as he was, had watched his most popular general become dangerously beloved by the army, that a man who inspired the kind of loyalty Zafar Khan inspired was a political threat as much as a military asset, that when the moment came to send reinforcements, Alauddin made a different kind of calculation, one that had nothing to do with battlefield tactics and everything to do with the survival of his own power. We cannot know with certainty which reading is true. We cannot get inside Alauddin's mind and see his intentions in that moment. What we know is what happened. Zafar Khan, surrounded by tens of thousands of Mongol warriors, cut off from support, fought on. He fought with the kind of desperate, magnificent violence that legends are made of. He and his men died on that field, taking enormous numbers of Mongols with them in their final stand. And Alauddin, with his reserve intact and his center holding, continued to fight the battle. Here is where the story pivots in a way that is almost difficult to believe, because after everything that happened, after the chaos of the Mongol assaults, after Zafar Khan's charge and death, after hours of brutal fighting across the entire field, the Mongols did something they almost never did. They hesitated. Qutlugh Khwaja, the commander of the entire invasion, was wounded during the fighting. The exact nature and severity of his wound varies across different sources, but its effect on Mongol decision-making was concrete and immediate. The command structure of the army, suddenly dealing with an incapacitated leader in the middle of an engagement that was not going as planned, began to falter. The psychological momentum that the Mongols relied on, the sense of inevitable, unstoppable advance, was disrupted, and standing across from them was Alauddin's reserve, intact, organized, fresh, waiting. Think about what the Mongol commanders were seeing at this point. They had brought 200,000 warriors against Delhi. They had fought for hours, They had inflicted enormous casualties, but the Delhi army had not broken. The center had held. The reserve had not been committed. And now, with their own commander wounded, and their assault stalled against an opponent that simply refused to collapse, the Mongol leadership had to make a calculation. To push forward meant fighting a fresh reserve force with an army that had already spent itself in hours of brutal combat. To keep pressing against soldiers who had shown that they would not run, against a sultan who had shown that he would not panic. The odds that had looked so certain when they crossed the Indus River a few weeks ago had shifted in ways that no Mongol war council had anticipated. The Mongol army began now to withdraw. Not in a rout, not in the kind of disorganized, panicked flight that the Mongols had so often imposed on their enemies. The withdrawal was disciplined and controlled, because even a retreating Mongol army was dangerous and organized. But they were retreating. They were leaving the field. The invasion was over. 200,000 warriors, the greatest military force in the world, turned north and began the long march back towards Central Asia. Delhi stood. The moment that the last Mongol rider disappeared over the northern horizon, something enormous shifted in the world. Not just in India. In the story of the Mongol Empire itself, the silence that followed the Battle of Kili must have felt almost surreal to the people who had lived through it. For weeks, the entire city of Delhi had existed under the shadow of possible annihilation. The sounds of preparation, soldiers drilling, forges working, supplies being moved, refugees praying, had defined every waking hour. And now the Mongols were gone, and Delhi was still standing, and the Sultan who had marched out to face the invincible was riding back through the gates of his city. The impact of this victory rippled outward in ways that are hard to fully quantify but easy to feel when you read the sources from the period. There was a change in the emotional register of the Delhi Sultanate, a shift from the constant background anxiety of a state that knew it was a target to something more like confidence, not arrogance. Alauddin was too smart for arrogance, but the settled, purposeful confidence of an army that has tested itself against the worst the world can throw at it and come out on the other side. Alauddin used that confidence immediately. He did not rest on what he had accomplished. He continued his military reforms. He continued building up reserves and training new soldiers. He continued refining his defensive systems and his intelligence network, because he knew with absolute certainty that the Mongols were not done with India. And he was right. In 1301, the Mongols returned. A force under a commander named Tagi pushed deep into Indian territory, this time reaching as far as Ranthambore in Rajasthan, a fortress of enormous strategic importance. The siege was intense and prolonged, and it tested everything Alauddin had built. But the fortress held long enough for Alauddin to respond with his army, and the Mongols eventually withdrew without achieving their objective. Then 1303, another massive invasion, and this one came terrifyingly close to a catastrophic outcome. The Mongol force that year, under a commander named Chagatai, actually reached Delhi and besieged the city while Alauddin was returning from a campaign in southern India. The timing was almost perfectly bad. Alauddin's main army was not in position, and for a period of weeks, Delhi was under direct Mongol pressure. But the fortifications held, Alauddin returned with his forces, and the Mongols again withdrew. It was close, closer than anyone wanted to admit, and each time the Mongols came close, Alauddin learned. He identified the gaps in his system and filled them. He accelerated the training of his army. He recruited more aggressively, expanded the cavalry, strengthened the positions along the northwestern approaches to Delhi. He turned the near disaster of 1303 into fuel for even more intensive preparation. By 1305, when the next major Mongol invasion came, an enormous force of approximately 60,000 warriors that crossed the Indus and drove toward the Gangetic Plain, Alauddin's army was ready in a completely different way than it had been at Kili. His general Malik Nayak met the Mongol forces at the Battle of Amroha, near the Ganges River, in what is now Uttar Pradesh, and the result was not close. The Delhi cavalry fell on the Mongols with a ferocity that reflected years of preparation and accumulated tactical experience. Tens of thousands of Mongol warriors were killed, thousands more were captured, The invasion was not just defeated, it was shattered. And then 1306, one more time, Mongol forces crossed the Ravi River in the Punjab. One more time, Alauddin's army was waiting. One more time, the invasion was crushed before it could threaten the heartland of India. The commander of that force was killed, his army decimated, the survivors fleeing back across the frontier. After 1306, the Mongols effectively stopped trying to conquer India during Alauddin's reign. 5 major invasions, 5 failures. At a time when the Mongols were still one of the dominant military powers in the world, a single sultan in Delhi had turned his kingdom into a wall they could not break. Now step back for a moment and think about what that actually means in the context of world history. Because this is the part that I think deserves to be said slowly and clearly, so it can land with the weight it actually carries. The Mongol Empire had destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate, which was the center of Islamic civilization for 5 centuries. Baghdad in 1258, the city of scholars and scientists, of libraries that contained the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world, of poets and mathematicians and astronomers who were centuries ahead of their European counterparts. All of it burned. The caliph himself, Al-Mustasim, was executed by being rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, a Mongol method that avoided spilling royal blood, while still achieving the desired outcome. The destruction of Baghdad was one of the most catastrophic single events in the history of human civilization, setting back the Islamic world by generations. The Mongols had brought China to its knees. They had made Russia into a vassal state that would spend the next 2 centuries under what the Russians call the Tatar yoke, a period of Mongol domination so complete that it fundamentally shaped Russian culture, politics, and psychology in ways that historians still argue about today. They had pushed into Poland and Hungary, defeating every army that faced them, stopped only by the death of Chagatai Khan in 1241, which forced the Mongol commanders to return east for the succession process. In the entire sweep of Mongol military history, the sustained, repeated, decisive defeats that Alauddin Khilji inflicted on the Mongol forces in India stand as one of the most remarkable defensive achievements of any era. He was doing something that nobody else in the world was doing. He was winning, consistently, against the greatest military force in human history. And the reason he was winning was not luck, it was not geography or climate, though those factors played a role. It was deliberate, systematic, brilliantly executed preparation and strategy. It was a ruler who had correctly identified the nature of the threat, correctly identified what it would take to meet it, and then had the will and the administrative genius to actually build the thing that was needed, rather than hoping it would work out somehow. There is another dimension to this story that most accounts of the Battle of Kili gloss over, and I want to spend a moment on it because it matters. The price of all this survival was paid by ordinary people who never appeared in any chronicle or historical account. Every time the Mongols crossed into India, every time they swept through Punjab, every time they moved toward the Gangetic Plain, they left devastation in their wake. Villages, crops destroyed, people killed or captured and sold into slavery. The refugees who crowded into Delhi before the Battle of Kili were not abstractions. They were families. Parents who had watched their homes reduced to ash. Children who had seen their fathers killed. Women who had lived through things that no source from the period would fully describe. And then there were the people of Delhi itself who had to live through the weeks of uncertainty, the drilling soldiers in the streets, the stockpiling of food, the religious ceremonies performed against the possibility that this time the walls would not hold. The emotional weight of knowing that the most feared army in the world was a few days' ride from your home and that everything depended on the judgment of a single sultan who had taken the throne by murder is something that the clean language of historical analysis tends to smooth away. History is lived by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The Battle of Kili was won by commanders and generals, but it was survived by everyone else, and their survival, the continued existence of Delhi, of its markets and its mosques and its schools and its families, was the real measure of what Alauddin accomplished. What became of the key figures in this story? Alauddin Khilji continued to rule the Delhi Sultanate until his death in January 1316. a reign of approximately 20 years in total from his seizure of power. In addition to his extraordinary record against the Mongols, he was responsible for a series of military campaigns into southern India, unprecedented in their reach. That extended the influence of the Sultanate further than it had ever gone before. He reformed the economy, built monuments, and maintained a court that attracted scholars and poets, even as his political methods remained brutal. He was, in every sense, a contradictory figure, a man of genuine brilliance and genuine cruelty, capable of extraordinary vision and extraordinary binary violence, often in the same breath. Malik Kafur, his most celebrated general in the southern campaigns, rose to enormous power in the final years of Alauddin's reign and played an increasingly controversial role in the court politics of the period. After Alauddin's death, the Sultanate went through a period of rapid instability, with multiple rulers coming and going in quick succession. The empire that Alauddin had built with such effort did not outlast him in its fullest form. The historical pattern of strong founder, weak successors played out in Delhi just as it had so many other places. Zafar Khan, who died at Kili, never received the monument or the recognition that his military abilities arguably deserved. His story has been largely absorbed into the broader narrative of the battle, his name appearing in the sources and then fading back out. But every historian who has looked closely at Kili has noted that the battle's outcome was shaped in part by his extraordinary charge, that the casualties his forces inflicted before being encircled were part of the reason the Mongol advance was slowed and ultimately broken. He died in circumstances that may have been partly of Alauddin's making, but he died fighting, and in the long chain of events that led to the Mongol withdrawal from Delhi, his death was one of the links. The Mongol Empire itself was already beginning to fracture by the time of Kili, though you could not have known it from watching that 200,000-man army march toward Delhi. The Great Khanate was splitting along succession lines and regional interests. Different branches of the Mongol royal family increasingly in conflict with each other, rather than united in conquest. The Chagatai Khanate, which launched the invasion of India, was engaged in bitter conflict with the Ilkhanate, the Mongol rulers of Persia and Iraq. At the same time it was trying to conquer Delhi. Resources and attention were divided. The empire that had been an overwhelming unified force under Genghis Khan was becoming something more complicated and less invincible. But none of that reduces what happened at Kili, because the force that Qutlugh Khwaja led into India in 1299 was real, and it was massive, and it was fully capable of destroying Delhi if it had been allowed to. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire did not stop the invasion. What stopped the invasion was Alauddin Khilji and the army he built and the battle he won. The Battle of Kili, 1299, a forgotten field outside Delhi. A 200,000-man army that had never lost, meeting a sultan who had spent 3 years building something specifically designed to beat them. A general who charged so far and so hard into the enemy that he never came back, and whose death may have been as much about palace politics as battlefield tactics. A reserve force held steady by an iron will, waiting for the moment that never quite came, but whose presence changed the entire calculation of the battle. A wounded Mongol commander whose injury tilted the scales at the critical moment. A city that stood when it should have fallen. This is the story that history buried. This is the battle that humiliated the most feared army in human story and turned India into the one corner of the medieval world where the Mongol tide broke against something stronger than itself. This is the story of how one man, with all his flaws and all his genius, changed the course of an entire civilization. There is a line in the Persian chronicles written after Alauddin's death that has always stayed with me. It says, in the scholar's translation, that he was a man in whom power and terror lived together, that he was loved by his soldiers and feared by everyone, that, under his rule, Delhi was a city that bent its knee to no one, not even the Mongols. If this story moved you, if you felt the dust of Kili, if you heard Zafar Khan's charge, if you stood with Alauddin at the moment the Mongol army turned back, then share this video with someone who loves history the way we do. Every view, every like, Every subscription is how we keep bringing these buried stories back to life. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, because next time we are going somewhere else that history forgot, to find another story that deserves to be told. The world is full of battles like Kili. We are just getting started.